poetry book in Canadian and international poetry journals. The Bellusci is a member of the Canadian Jacques Maritain Association, the Canadian Society of Renaissance Studies, and the 16th Century Society and Conference. He's also an assistant professor in philosophy and theology at the Catholic Pacific College faculty at Trinity Western since 2017. And please join me today to give us a talk on the truth and meaning of human sexuality. Please join me to welcome him with a round of applause.
Thank you, Bishop Hector, and thank you everyone for coming this evening to hear about truth and meaning in human sexuality. I had chosen this as the picture that I wanted to use for this topic, and that's the Sacred Heart of Jesus. The Sacred Heart of Jesus. When we talk about love, there's one way really to understand love, and that is through the Sacred Heart. And also this diocese has the name of the Sacred Heart, the cathedral, Sacred Heart Cathedral. So it's good to remember that when we are thinking of love, we are thinking of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and this blessing to be here, where the diocese is named after the Sacred Heart. And here it says, Adveniat regnum tuum, may your kingdom come. So the theme is education and human sexuality. And of course, education starts with children. The focus, in fact, of this document on the truth and meaning of human sexuality is really directed towards how do we educate children, because at the end, it is the children who are going to be making lifetime decisions concerning marriage, concerning religious life, or simply the single life. And so when we look at human sexuality, there are three angles. One is the Word of God, that is the Scriptures, the tradition, the teachings of the Church, the magisterium. The magisterium did not start last year. It started 2,000 years ago. So we build on 2,000 years of teaching, of tradition, magisterial teaching, and of course, natural law. Natural law is often implicit in church teaching. It doesn't always specifically state this is a natural law position, but natural law is what we can know simply from human reason. We do not need revelation for natural law. Basically, natural law is what makes common sense, right? God has given us intelligence, and we participate in divine intelligence through our own intelligence that he has given us, all right? So when we are trying to discern whether something is true or false, we can simply draw from our understanding based on natural law. We all have this capacity. We are created with intelligence, and that means we can participate in divine intelligence through the natural law. The focus of this document that was issued by the Council of the Family is that God is love, which comes from the first letter of St. John. God is love. We know this is central to the Christian faith, and this is why the Sacred Heart, I think, is this beautiful expression of God's love as enfleshed in his Son, Jesus. We're all called to love, right? So the fact that God is love means that there is a response to divine love, and that is being called to love ourselves. That is called to love ourselves, reaching out to others, ultimately to God. From 1 Peter, we have this reference, again, with regards to this childlike disposition, like obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires that you formerly had in ignorance. Right? So formerly had, if he is addressing the pagans in a neo-pagan surround or a pagan surrounding, the desires you had in ignorance, right? The life of Christ takes you out of this ignorance. Peter is saying. So instead, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all your conduct, for it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. So ultimately, love is a call to holiness. Love will manifest itself in these holy relations that we experience. And in fact, in the Second Vatican Council document of Lumen Gentium, we have the declaration that we are all called to holiness. So the focus is holiness, right? How do we grow in holiness? What are the obstacles in that road to holiness? And how do we convey this fundamentally to children, right? How do we teach children this path to holiness? So first of all, human love is self-giving. It is self-giving when it is generous, when we are seeking the good of the other, when there is this desire to be virgin or celibate or chaste in married love. These are all ways in which human love is self-giving. And it creates the good of persons and communities. So notice that human love as self-giving is really focused on the good of the other. It is focused on the good of the other. It is not self-focused or self-centered. It is focused on the other. And so we can say that it creates the good of persons or of communities, all right? So the building of persons, the building of communities. This focus on the other, this is really central to our understanding of Christian love. It is focused on the other. Human love then is selfish, and we know that human love is and can be selfish, and this is largely due to original sin, the effects of original sin. And this is when our love is self-focused, when we say it's all about me, right? It's all about me, what I get, how I'm gratified, how I benefit, I am the focus. So this is when human love is selfish, when it is pleasure-seeking, how can I maximize my pleasure in this relationship? So love that is simply pleasure-seeking. Or utilitarian, right? Our interest in someone, not because we love this person, but because we benefit in the relationship with that person. We call that utilitarian. How can I benefit in this relationship? And the only thing that matters is, either it generates pleasure or that it generates some kind of benefits. This is simply selfish love. Love and human sexuality, then, we know from scriptures, and we can also know this from natural law. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So already in the first book of the Bible, in the first chapter of the Bible, we already have this differentiation of man and woman, this sexual complementarity that is very clear, male and female. And furthermore, we have this, the man who leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. So we notice that the union or the conjugal union between the man and the woman is something that is natural. This comes from God. This comes from our nature. And this is how love is going to express itself the way God created it. So we can also see another distinction then, and this is this distinction between femininity and masculinity. They are complementary gifts, right? Female, male, through which human sexuality is an integrating part of the concrete capacity of love, which God has inscribed in the man and the woman, right? So the man and the woman each, the woman as feminine with her femininity, the man as masculine with his masculinity, their sexuality, each being different, is fundamental to who they are as human beings, man and woman. Every form of love will always bear this masculine and feminine character. Every form of love will bear this masculine and feminine character. So education in sexuality means to teach the value of love, that love is positive, it is a positive experience. This is, of course, when we're educating children. Here the focus is always children. The value of the vocation, the vocation as something virginal or celibate or single or chaste in marriage. So education in sexuality begins with this favorable, positive disposition towards love, and also the way in which love opens us to these different vocations. We are told that man is called to love in his unified totality, body and spirit. This is important to remember, body and spirit. That's what we mean by totality, because today what we only understand is body. Everything is reduced to what the body is, how we can manipulate the body, transform the body, reconstruct the body. The body, basically, this is a materialist vision of the body that is gratified or can be gratified. This is all a bodily understanding of the person. And notice we have spirit. We are spiritual beings. We're not just bodily beings, all right? We are spiritual beings because we are in soul. We have a soul. So we need to understand the body and reclaim the spiritual dimension of the body, which has been lost. We are not just corporeal beings, we are also, and fundamentally, spiritual beings. So that includes the human body, and the body is made a sharer in spiritual love, which means then, because we are in soul, we have souls, it means that love is a spiritual experience, not a bodily experience. It's not just what you can do with me as a body, but what you also do for me, or what I can do for you as a spiritual being. So the life of virtue then, which is how we can enter into these relationships through virtue. There are unquestionable certainties. We can be temperate, right? We can be temperate. We can grow and learn and acquire temper. We are not born with these virtues, but we can acquire them. We can acquire the virtue of being chaste, the virtue of fortitude, sometimes used as known by the word courage. We acquire the virtue of courage and the virtue of prudence. So we're all capable of acquiring these virtues. Nobody can say, I can't do that. I can't live chaste ways. We can. We are all capable of doing this. We're all capable of acquiring courage, right? And you acquire this like any virtue. How? By exercising the virtue, by concrete situations where now you're called to being prudent, or being temperate, or being chaste, or being courageous. That's how we acquire virtues. We're put in situations where we need now to draw from this virtue, and we exercise it. Right? So virtues are something very concrete. That's how we grow in virtue. They're not something theoretical. They're something very real. Right? They connect us with the reality in which we find ourselves. So freedom is going to be found in self-mastery. By being able to exercise these virtues, then we can grow in the love that we are called to grow, the true love that we are called to grow in. Virginal and married love are the two forms which the person's called to love is fulfilled, right? So there's basically the celibate life, or there's going to be the married life. And the celibate life, the virginal life, can be as a consecrated person, or it can be as a single person, just as it can be also the in the married life, a chaste, right? The married life is still chaste. Chastity is a spiritual power. So in all these instances, what we have as a common denominator in terms of the spiritual life is the chaste disposition. And we're told chastity is the spiritual power which frees love from selfishness and aggression, right? It frees love from selfishness and aggression. St. John Paul II writes, when it comes to education and chastity, he says, the development of contemporary civilization is linked to a scientific and technological progress that is often achieved in a one-sided way, and thus appears purely positivistic. Positivism results in agnosticism in theory and utilitarianism in practice and in ethics. So again, technology gives us this positivistic way of looking at the world. Positivistic simply means in material terms. Right? We lose the sense of the spiritual. Technology does not tell us something of the spiritual. So it's easy to disconnect from that. And the positivism, then agnosticism, is basically having some sort of vague belief in God. That's really what agnosticism is. It's not a denial of God, but just some vague belief that God exists. And utilitarianism, as I mentioned, is just looking at the human body or relationships in terms of how useful they are, right? We live in a culture where things are disposable. When they're no longer useful, we just throw them away. And the danger is that we start to treat people in the same way, utilitarian relationships. This person no longer does any good for me. I'm no longer happy in this relationship. I'm no longer in love. So the relationship is over, right? Utilitarian. And this is why it shows you how we will then practice our ethics, right? The usefulness of someone, the unusefulness of someone, right? The person is no longer of any use. And we see this in relationships, when relationships end because the person no longer brings any kind of fulfillment or satisfaction, and then they just move on to the next relationship. Right, so we can see that St. John Paul II, as in most of his writing, he's quite prophetic. He sees where things are moving, and he's calling us back to reclaim our spiritual nature. We are spiritual beings and not just bodily beings. So in the light of vocation, as we look at vocations, we see that married love has 4 characteristics in particular. And this comes, in fact, from Humane Vitae, that was issued by St. Paul Hussein, now St. Paul VI. Friendship, right? Friendship, the faithfulness, the exclusivity, that is the totality in this relationship given to one person in an exclusive way, and the fecundity or the fruitfulness of that relationship. But it's interesting how we have friendship, right? Married love starts with this attraction. Love, in fact, is an attraction. When you are attracted to someone, there's like this movement forwards, you're kind of like mobilized. You know, it could be passions, it could be emotions, but you're somewhat mobilized towards this person whom you're attracted to. And that from there, as a result of maybe affinities that you have with this person, getting to know the person, friendship is developed. And from there, you build the friendship into a more intimate relationship until what we have here is love, marriage. St. John Paul II, also in his letter to the families, conveys the family as a community of persons. We hear a lot of this in his writing, Communio Personarum. This is a fundamental part of St. John Paul II's philosophy, this whole Communio Personarum, this communion of persons. And it has this, we see this in an analogous form in the Trinitarian persons, right? The union of the divine persons and the union of God's children in truth and love. So fundamental to this spirituality is this communion. The spirituality of love is this communion of person. Trinitarian persons, we see this in marriage, and we see this in relationships, right? Even in friendships, this communion of persons. The need for truth and love is an essential dimension of the life of the person. The need for truth and love is an essential dimension of the life of the person. Notice it's not just love. Sometimes people think you just need love and then you're okay. No, it's not just love. You need truth. In fact, truth needs to be that driving force that directs love, as opposed to love itself, which can be quite ephemeral. We need truth, right? We need truth to direct it. So both are needed. They're both essential dimensions in our lives. And so with truth and love, then we are open to God and to God's creatures. In fact, truth ultimately leads us to God. If we were non-believers and we simply sought what is true, truth would eventually lead us to God. Okay? And this is also true for love. As we seek the good, the good would also seek us eventually, lead us eventually to God. And this person does not have to be a Christian for this, just using our intelligence and following our desires, a desire for the good. This would lead us ultimately to the ultimate good, which is God. So Christian marriage is a sacrament which gives expression to human sexuality on a path to holiness. Notice that the sacrament is inseparable from holiness, right? Integral to this sacrament is the path to holiness that is reinforced by the indissoluble unity of the sacrament. In other words, the indissoluble unity of the husband and the wife who have made the sacrament. That the spouses may remain faithful to each other forever. Fidelity of spouses flows from the communion of person, notice again the communio personarum, and then rooted in the plan of the Creator, again this Trinitarian love, and in the sacrament expressing union between Christ and His Church. So in this we see the richness of the sacrament. When we talk about Christ and His Church, here we have this reference to Ephesians chapter 5, where St. Paul speaks of Christ as the groom and the church as the bride. So we again have this analogy in married love with the church itself. Now, what are the issues when it comes for parents with children? First of all, the parents are the first educators, right? It's not the teachers who are the first educators or the next door neighbor who's the first educator. It is the parents who are the first educators of their children, and they are responsible for the formation of chastity of their children. This is the parents' formation responsibility. And two dimensions of conjugal union cannot be artificially separated, which is a unitive and procreative aspect. And this is what the children will learn over time simply through the relationship they have with their parents. So when we see the father and mother as educators, there's this principle of subsidiarity. Right? The family needs support of the state and society. Right? In other words, they cannot always just manage on their own. They need structures within the state and society to support them, to promote social policies which have the family as their principal object. Right? So social policies should have the family as their principal object. This would be the principle of subsidiarity. Bringing up of children and looking after the elderly, this is also part of this principle. Adequate resources, efficient means of support. All right, so this principle means that the family then should be able to have the state that is also there to help them out. They're not completely on their own. Now, parents should also learn to listen to their children. This is in communicating with their children and eventually preparing them for discussions around sexuality. They should first of all be listening to their children. They should make an effort to understand their children and to recognize even in their rebellions elements of truth. All right, it's very easy to see in a rebellious child just the rebellion, but to also identify elements of truth in their rebellions. And this is just to foster a relationship where children will then turn to their parents when they have questions of a more personal nature, and similarly, parents will be able to talk to them of these more personal conversations. So education and love in the home starts with the love of God. And these are the moral truths practiced by the parents themselves. So the parents themselves are setting an example to the children by the moral truths they practice. So this is true when they are children, when they are adolescents, and when they're still young adults. And this is in relation with God, with parents, with siblings, with companions of the opposite and same sex, and with other adults. In other words, throughout all these different relationships that the children have, they need to be guided in these moral truths. moral truths as practiced by the parents, and then they will in turn instruct the children in these different relationships. Relationships are not just with parents, it's also the children in their relationship with God, with their siblings, companions, and so on, right? How do we guide them in moral truths in these different relationships? Teaching chastity to children through self-control. Temperance, self-control presupposes temperance, respect, and basically respect, for example, for what the parents are telling the children, certain modesty in the way they talk and dress, so in their speech, in their actions, yes, and in their dress. So, we call this creating boundaries or establishing boundaries where children learn there are certain things that they cannot do, or things that they cannot say, or types of behavior that the parents will correct. They cannot just go running around the house like little pagans. They need to be corrected. They need to be instructed, right? If you don't have any barriers, they're not taught, for example, to be temperate, with self-control, the way they talk, then it will be much more difficult as they get older, as they're adolescents, as they're young adults. So it starts in childhood, and all of this here will affect chastity. So the parents also serve as models for their children, the mother in her femininity, her maternal vocation, and this in turn gives us the sense of the value of womanhood for the sons, and then for the father, the masculine dignity, the admiration and respect that he has from his sons, and then the father will also provide security for the daughters. Okay, what are the challenges? Okay, this is sort of the culture we're living in, what we might call privations or imbalances. Very often the father is absent. It could be because of work. The mother might be absent for the same reason, because of work. And sometimes, and often the case today is having one-parent families, because beyond the control of one of the spouses, the other spouse left, and now the spouse is left alone with the children. And these are specific challenges for the parents. And they're privations in a way, because then the children does not have the mother with them at home, or they don't have the father with them at home. So there's this kind of privation that takes place because the mother or the father is absent. And children should have both parents with them, and they can tell that something is not right when they don't have both parents with them. But it's beyond the control of the parent if someone leaves, one of the spouses leaves. I mean, it's beyond, they can't really do anything about that if the other spouse is left. So these privations are going to be challenges for these family structures. Nevertheless, the family should be a home of faith and prayer, right? So making it a habit of praying at home. I've come across quite a few of the children whom I speak to from Indian homes, from India and Filipino homes, where they typically have an altar. They typically have an altar in the home, and they will pray around the altar. They'll have a rosary, they'll pray the rosary together, but it's around an altar. So these houses, and even when I was in India this past May, every single day, the little shrine that the family has, every single day, the whole family came together to pray. Like there were about 10 people all together. They said these prayers. So it was a family, prayer was a family, a time where the family came together, like a spiritual bonding, in fact, of the family. So the presence of God the Father is sensed in the family that is praying together. The word of Jesus is accepted. The Spirit's bond of love is felt. And the Mother of God is loved and invoked. So part of the child's experience growing up, as opposed to waiting until the child is an adolescent and they're not going to church, and then you're wondering why. Well, it's because they've never really experienced any prayer in the home to begin with. So these instructions start from childhood, these experiences, so that they are normal and not sort of peripheral to family life. There are 4 general principles in instructing the child. Each child is unique and receives an individualized formation. So this is when sexual topics come up of a sexual nature. The children are different, and so the discussions with each child will be different. There's the moral dimension of sexuality that has both marriage and celibacy or virginity. The formation in chastity should be a timely formation regarding sexuality. So there are certain things that are brought up later in life and not too early, for example. And the information that is brought to the child should be done with a certain sensitivity so that it's neither vague nor explicit. Okay, and parents are the best ones to determine this. How much should my child know, and at what stage should they know? That's why the parents are the best educators when it comes to sexual education. Also, how to grow in love with God, with neighbor, and overcome difficulties. Difficulties are part of human life. How do we overcome these difficulties? How do we learn to be compassionate and forgiving? Also, the need to discipline the senses and the mind, watchfulness and prudence, in avoiding occasions of sin. Okay, prudence is that virtue where we know how to avoid the occasion of sin. And it's surprising how often people will be repeating the same sins in confession, for example, and you wonder if they have learned this, if they've learned prudence or not yet, right? So you just ask them, well, if you've had this experience already, because you've been in a certain situation where you've fallen into sin, shouldn't you be able to avoid that situation so you're not repeating the same sin? This is where prudence comes in. So this can also be instructed to the children as they grow up, guiding them and giving them examples. The observance of modesty, moderation and recreation. This is interesting, moderation and recreation. In other words, every day is not like some kind of a holiday. We want to have, every day is not a party. Like we want to have dinner time as if it's a party every single day, right? And it's not. The reality is there should be moderation in these kind of leisure activities and recreation, and that includes food, wholesome pursuits. There are some things that might not be healthy. Assiduous in prayer and frequent reception of the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist, and devotion to the Immaculate Mother of God. This is how the children will grow up and grow up growing in virtue. There's 4 stages to the child development that is given. The first is years of innocence. This is 5 years to puberty. This is a more tranquil period for the child and serene. And so they should not be disturbed with unnecessary information about sex. This is one of the controversial issues that came up in Ontario. They were introducing sex education. It was quite explicit and detailed in the Catholic schools, and it was just they were way too young. I mean, I don't even know if they needed that information that they were giving them, but they were following a government sex education program. And the big controversy was too much information, and they're too young for this information. They don't need it, right? So here we have years of innocence. Let the child enjoy these years of innocence. Parents should encourage collaboration, generosity, and even self-denial. That is during these years so the children can learn something like self-denial. Some societies impose premature sex information on children. Okay, that would be the example of the schools. We have some public Catholic schools. In Ontario, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding them because the parents, as I said, feel that the information they're getting is too soon, too explicit, and it's unnecessary. Parents should firmly exclude attempts to violate children's innocence. So parents should be aware of what their children are learning in school. So in other words, parents need to be informed. What are they learning in school? They might not necessarily be told by the teacher, so they should find out what does the syllabus look like, where it involves sex education. There could be problems with premature sex information from mass media, right? So they have access to the social media, or they have access to the mainstream media through the internet. All the kids now seem to have iPads where they have access to the internet, or their peers. And so the parents need to be aware of this. Parents need to be aware of what their children are absorbing and even assimilating. Puberty then is the second phase, onset of adolescence. It's a period of self-discovery where there's the reality of the impulses now of sexuality. So here they can learn the value of chastity, understanding chastity, for example, helping the child understand the value of sexuality in relation to procreation, marriage, and the family. Girls who can be helped by their mothers, boys can be helped by their fathers. And it's unnecessary, even at this stage, to go into explicit details of sexual union, even at this stage. So puberty, there's no need to go into explicit details, unlike what is taught in the schools, which goes even younger than puberty into sexual details that, as I said, are not really necessary for the child. So there's a widespread hedonistic mentality in our culture. Hedonistic, you know, simply means pursuit of pleasure. There's something even called a school of hedonistic ethics. Hedonistic ethics is basically what brings me pleasure. Of course, it's all about me, the pleasure that I get in my relationships and how I live my life. So this hedonistic mentality, the pursuit of pleasure, leads to a contraceptive mentality in marriage, because then marriage is simply about pleasure. And so hence the contraceptives. Sexuality perceived in hedonistic and materialistic terms needs to be corrected. So if children, as they're growing up and given the surrounding culture, look at sexuality simply in terms of pleasure or in terms of relationships in terms of pleasure, that's materialistic, then this needs to be corrected. It's the parents that need to correct this, all right? You're not going to get it from the teachers at the schools. You will only get it from the parents who make this proper assessment of what the child understands. The moral conscience is to do good and avoid evil. This is part of the natural law, right? We naturally are inclined to do what is good, and we are naturally inclined to avoid evil, all right? But to do what is good, you need to be informed. Your intelligence needs to tell you this is good and this is evil, all right? So the intelligence is part of our nature, and we need to use our intelligence to help us identify those things that are good and avoid those things that are evil. So good choices are approved and evil choices are denounced, right? This, we need our intelligence to direct us for this. Adolescence is a period of self-projection, discovery of one's vocation, and we all have this vocation to universal holiness, right? This is St. Paul VI, St. John Paul II, who reiterates this. So we see in Christian morality that marriage is indissoluble, and marriage is this relationship between love and procreation. In immorality, so Christian morality, we understand fundamentally what human sexuality is meant for, which is love that is procreative in the context of marriage. Immorality would then be premarital sexual relations, abortion, contraception, masturbation, and homosexual activity. All of these fall under immorality. Masturbation is treated as a serious disorder and cannot be morally justified, and can be influenced by different factors, the period of adolescence the child is in, psychological imbalance, often associated with situations of stress, and habitual behavior, basically a vice. When pornography is involved, it's actually an addiction, not even a vice, but an addiction. And it's something that needs to be corrected. It cannot be justified, it cannot be rationalized, it needs to be corrected. Homosexual relations, which are spreading more and more in urbanized societies. The person should be helped and should seek an expert to help them. Homosexuals are called to chastity, and homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered and violate natural law. So the fact that they violate anything that violates natural law is considered intrinsically disordered, right? It goes against human nature. And natural law participates in the eternal law of God, right? So ultimately, if something is disordered, and we can know this from natural law that participates in the eternal law means that drawing from the eternal law, it violates God's law. It violates God's law. And it's important to remember that nobody is above the eternal law of God. We cannot take the eternal law of God and rationalize it at a human level. We cannot. It's God's law. This is outside of revelation, right? It's not because it's revealed. It's because we understand it based on human nature that leads us back to the eternal law of God. And so no one is above the eternal law of God. What's important also for the children is to discover the value of friendship, because friendship is this expression of love with someone with whom you feel close, whom you're drawn to, with whom you can share your experiences with, someone with whom you have an affinity. Just this experience of love ultimately can give us a sense of, in an analogous way, what the love of God must be like, right? If we can experience that in friendship, how much more experiencing it directly in this, within the presence of God. So finally, adulthood is the Christian conscience now that has been formed. And we're told, this is in Philippians, it's a beautiful passage. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellency, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. I notice true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, gracious. Think about these things if it's to be worthy of praise. All right, so parents as educators, remember the focus here is the sex education. Sex education is a right and duty of parents. It is a right and duty of parents. So parents cannot kind of pass on the responsibility to someone else unless they choose to. You can say, okay, I'm not going to take responsibility of this. I'm going to leave it to the teachers. You can do that. But it is, first of all, your responsibility as a parent. Now, you can choose to give this responsibility to someone else, but that is something that you have decided. But it is, first of all, your right and duty of parents to educate the child in sexual matters. Sex education carried out by persons outside should be accepted by the parents and is not a substitute. So someone outside the family, it should not be a substitute for the parents, because the parents know what is best for their children. They know where they're at. The substitute does not know where your children are at in terms of their moral life, in terms of the personal issues that they're dealing with. So recommendations, parents associate with other parents, right? This helps parents determine at least the education that the children are receiving, the kind of problems the children might be having, the kind of questions that they have. They can have other parents as a point of reference. Obviously, parents who are reliable and trustworthy. Parents keep themselves informed on the content and methodology of supplementary sex education. In other words, what is being taught in the schools. And so you know what you have taught or have not taught your children, what is being taught in the school, because that's the other place where it would be taught. Parents have a right to be informed and a right to be present during the sex education classes. So if you know that they're teaching sex education a particular day, then you should be able to be there if you want to be there to find out what is being taught in that class. And parents should remove their children whenever this education does not correspond to their own principles. Okay, and this has happened in schools in the past, and this has also been a point of controversy where the school expects the child to be present and the child cannot be removed, and this causes controversy between the school and then the parents, because the parents do not want the children to be receiving this kind of education, and the school says that, well, it's required. These are areas of contention, and this has happened repeatedly, especially across Ontario, because the Catholic schools in Ontario are publicly funded. Educators and teachers. No educator or teacher, not even parents, can interfere with the child's right to chastity. So if the child simply wants to remain pure and does not want to be told about these sexual topics, the child has a right to simply remain in its desire to be chaste, even in the child's own thoughts. Chastity includes thoughts, not just actions. Respect be given to the right of the child, the young adult, by their own parents on moral and sexual questions. In other words, this is where sensitivity comes in. What are the right questions to ask? And respect be given to the right of the child or the young adult to be withdrawn from any sexual instruction given outside the home. Okay, so as you can see, it's very delicate because the desire is to what might be perceived as corrupting the mind of the child. If the child wants to, is innocent on many topics, you don't want to sort of lead the child into thinking of things that it never thought about, was not thinking about, sort of be corrupting the mind of the child. The child has a very pure mind, and there's no reason why this purity cannot be preserved. I remember in class, it was, I think it was the virtue ethics class that I was teaching, and we were talking about, I was giving a scene to the students. These are college students, and I was giving them a scene, asking them how would they act in this scene. And I said, the situation is, there is a young woman, there's a friend of yours, she's a young woman, she's a fellow student at the college, and she sends you a text message. She sends you a text message. This is a male student. You're friends with her. She sends you a text message. She says to you in the text message, will you please come over? I'm alone. Okay. Will you please come over? I'm alone. What would you do with that kind of a text message? Would you go to her place because she is alone, or would you not? And one of the male students answered, yes, I would go to her place. I would go to her place. And you see, he took it very differently from what I had intended, right? This would be imprudent to go to this female's place if she's all alone, and you're all alone, and it's a fellow student. The student in the class was thinking she's by herself and she needs someone alone to sort of protect her, keep her company, because she was afraid. He took it very differently. So just to say that we can think along one lines, for example, prudence, and the student who is thinking very innocently is thinking simply in terms of protecting her, right? Just keeping her company because her parents aren't home, and she's calling someone just to be there with her. So because you're home, you're alone, you're afraid. So he was thinking it a bit more in terms of just being there to as a companion to protect her. So there were two very different ways. And so, I mean, I thought it was, I still was thinking it was imprudent. But anyway, he was thinking in very innocent terms, and I left that at that. I thought, okay, well, he's thinking just he wants to be with his friend and just protect her. So we were trying to educate at the same time, without corrupting minds, right? Because we can feel that, in fact, at the end, what we're doing is we're corrupting an innocent mind. And this is why instruction in chastity or sexuality, this is why the document says that we need to be very sensitive and very delicate how we go about it, trying to get a sense of what is known, what they know and what they don't know. There's a book I wrote on Pier Giorgio Frassati. He's a wonderful model for virtue. And when he was an adolescent, he wanted to go to frequent confession. And his mother did not want him to go. She said, well, what would you need frequent confession? I mean, you're not committing any serious sins or anything like that. And he said, well, because I receive the Eucharist frequently, and I should be receiving frequent confession as well. So the mother went to go talk to the priest to tell the priest, you're not going to see my son for frequent confession because I don't know what kind of questions you're going to ask him. right? So what was the mother doing? She was trying to protect the innocence she knew her son was very innocent, right? And she was concerned that the priest might ask questions that, without intending to, might lead the son to think of things that he did not even have on his mind. The priest replied, "Don't worry, I've handled 14-year-olds for a long time, and you have nothing to worry about." Eventually, his name is Pier Giorgio Frassati. Eventually, his mom gave him permission to have frequent confession. You see, there's a mother, an example where she does not want the son's purity corrupted. And ironically, somewhat paradoxically, it would even be in the confessional, but it's simply because she wasn't sure what the priest would be asking her son. So this is the what it means when the parents know the child, the sensitivity to the child that they would have based on what they know. So there are 4 working principles in educating the children. One is the principle of doctrine. That is the fundamental difference that there is between the man and the woman. The effects of original sin, that is, even though baptism removes original sin, we all experience the effects of it, the reality of sin, in other words. The importance of conscience formation, that the child learns that certain things are wrong and you cannot do them, certain things are permissible, and virtue building, right? How do you build virtue starting in childhood, right? How do you teach a child temperance, right? You cannot have a cookie whenever you want a cookie, for example, right? You cannot go, you cannot watch or play video games whenever you want to play video games. There has to be a sense of you cannot do certain things at certain times. So that builds virtue. The principle of timing, the whole notion of what is appropriate for the child to learn at what age. This is also, as I said, controversial because you give too much information at a very young age, maybe even too explicit. They don't need to know it. So this is the principle of timing. What is suitable? The topic of homosexuality should not be considered before adolescence, right? So in the syllabi, they already have this in the elementary schools, in the sex education programs in elementary schools, and here where the church says it should not even be homosexuality should not be even considered before adolescence. No erotic material should be presented to children or youth at any age, individually or in a group. All right, so using kind of the idea that you're using diagrams and pictures to help explain, human biology, relationships, and none of these materials should be used in instructing children. The principle of decency, to safeguard the virtue of Christian chastity, transmitting sexual information must always be positive, prudent, clear, and delicate. So notice this, the human sexuality is something good because God's created it, prudent in terms of how we engage in relationships, clear, right, using language of clarity rather than ambiguity or vagueness, and delicate, this sensitivity of the child. Then the principle of respect. No child or adolescent should be invited or feel obliged to act in a way that could offend against modesty. So, if you have in some schools, I was reading that some schools in the United Kingdom, they would have days where, the boys would go dressed up as girls and the girls dressed up as boys, right? So they have the experience of being dressed in the opposite gender. A child should not be subjected to this. They should not be subjected to this, but this is what the school does. This is an example of going against the modesty of a child. So the methods that are used are really this particular dialogue between the children and the parents. We talk about, well, what is the methodology? What's dialogue? A personal dialogue. Recommended methods, couples can share and provide resources, that is friends who come across. A lot of the students that I teach are actually from families where they are homeschooled. And in the homeschooled families, they share a lot of the information that helps the families on these topics. They share resources. Sometimes there are problematic issues, and parents can participate in a meeting with their children led by experts, right? Problematic issues that can come up, and so you bring the child to an expert. This could be a priest, a counselor, an educator, a doctor. Perhaps in some instances, for greater freedom for the child, only the child should be there, or the daughter should be there if the child still doesn't feel that they're uneasy with expressing their problem in the presence of the parents. So sex education may be entrusted to a trustworthy educator for pastoral reasons or expertise. So what that would mean is that you don't see yourself as being competent in certain areas, and so you leave it with a person who is more competent in that area. Just you need to be very careful whom you choose, because today the focus is really affirming whatever the child is experiencing, as opposed to giving any kind of direction or guidance. So you need to be very vigilant in terms of the kind of person you choose. And then also there are more and more laws that are making this restrictive. So you need to sort of navigate this carefully. Catechesis and morality with emphasis on sexual ethics at puberty, adolescence. Parents should take interest in catechesis outside the home to supplement their own formation of their children. So they should themselves be learning and reading and studying, so they can supplement their children with education. And religious formation of parents, catechetical preparation for adults in truth and love. So parents should be reading catechetical material that can help them in instructing their children. What should be avoided is essentially ideologies. So we go back to the materialistic education from a secularized approach, which is promoting abortion, sterilization, contraception, to be avoided. Sex education, counselors, therapists, evident in publications and out of harmony with the teachings of the natural law, the gospel, and the church. So if you're wondering about whether to see or have your child see a counselor, all you have to do is see what type of material this counselor has published, or where the counselor has studied, or whether the counselor has is listed on maybe the Archdiocesan website. In Vancouver, the Archdiocese has a whole list of counselors, so that you can just consult one of these counselors on the Archdiocesan website. At least you know that they're recognized and approved by the diocese. So that's, you know, some reassurance that you're moving in the right direction with therapy or counseling or whatever might be the case. Sex education given to children, teaching intimate details of genital relationships such as safe sex and AIDS. This also needs to be avoided in methods and approaches. Value clarification, you sometimes are given these very complex situations, moral situations, which becomes confusing for the child, and this doesn't really help them, other than leading them to relativism, right? Because they cannot resolve these complex moral cases. And sometimes the insertion, this also to be avoided, the insertion of sexual education in other subjects. So the subject might be useful, such as health or hygiene, family life, but inside this, then they start to talk about sexual matters that sort of cloaks what this education is actually doing. So take, for example, when you have this in libraries, you have this drag queen hour. Well, the children are going to just going to read. They're not going there for the drag queen hour. But what they're doing is they're taking this drag queen hour, putting it in a literary context, and this is how children are going to be exposed to transsexuals and so on, right? So it looks like it's something legitimate because it's simply literary, but in actual fact, there is a way of transmitting some ideology. Enculturation in education. Enculturation means creating harmonious relationship between culture and faith, right? So need to remember the Christian faith transcends the entire natural and cultural order, compatible with all cultures insofar as conforming to right reason and will. So the faith transcends culture, but it will take what is compatible with Christianity. So when the Christian missionaries went to Africa and there was polygamy, practice, well, polygamy is not compatible with Christian culture. So they needed to learn that you can have one wife and not more than one wife. This would be an example of sort of purifying the culture. Grace respects nature, healing in it the wounds of sin, comforting and elevating it. So where people are wounded or even a woundedness in the culture, grace again should elevate that culture. Christ and the gospel have absolute precedence over the culture. So the gospel comes first. Explicit and premature sex education can never be justified in the prevailing secularized culture. So that speaks to us because we live in secularized cultures. People will say, for example, oh, well, times have changed. The church has to keep up with the times. There's, all these shifts, and therefore this justifies the kind of sex education we have now, right? Well, this does not justify the kind of sex education we have now, right? There is a prevailing secularized culture. The thing is, we need to be able to uphold our principles as Christians and not assimilate to the dominant culture, the dominant neo-pagan culture that surrounds us. In traditional cultures, parents must not accept practices that are contrary to Christian morality. So if there's something that is contrary to Christian morality, you do not accept it. However, the particular role of the family in such cultures must be respected without imposing any Western model of sex education. So you respect the local cultural models, you don't impose Western models, but what is Christian needs to be upheld. Okay, so the sources for this were essentially from Cardinal Trujillo from the Pontifical Council of the Family. I'm going to just spend a few minutes going into this other section now. Striving for holiness, combating pornography. Pornography, this goes to the encyclical of St. Paul VI, the prophetic encyclical. Pornography, this is directly from the encyclical. Pornography instrumentalizes and dehumanizes the person, whether an adult or child, for one purpose, sexual gratification. The slippery slope had already been anticipated by Pope Paul VI in 1968. In his prophetic statement, man growing used to contraceptive practices may finally lose respect for the woman and no longer caring for her physical and psychological equilibrium may come to the point of considering her as a mere instrument of selfish enjoyment. And in fact, this slippery slope has brought us where we are today. What are the signs of pornographic addiction now? Three, this is based on my book here. I basically reduced it to three. I have a couple of copies of my book. Three signs of addiction: acts that are repetitive. Repetitive is not enough. You need to have all three. Repetitive. Another one is unwanted. The person says, well, I don't want to do this, but I cannot stop doing this. And this leads us to powerless, this feeling that I want to stop, but I cannot stop. I am powerless to stop these acts. And so three indicators of addiction. Repetitive is a kind of obsessive compulsive behavior. To view, in the case of pornography, you're just thinking about viewing pornographic images. This occurs daily or with high frequency until finally you consume the sexual material through online searches, downloaded material, and so on. And then the ease to carry out sexual acts, deriving gratification from one's own body. Okay, so this is kind of what obsessive compulsive behavior is like. This is the first category of addiction, repetitive. The definition of obsessive compulsive, this comes from Al Cooper, 2002 work. There's something that's called the AAA engine that has made pornography as widespread as it is. AAA, so A for access, A for anonymity, and A for affordability. You can access pornography very easily. And when you're accessing it, you're quite anonymous because you're in your own room. And it's affordable, well, because in fact, it costs nothing at all, right? You don't have to pay anything. So this is quite different from a time. This is with our technology today. There was a time when you would have to go into a shop and actually purchase a magazine. You could be seen purchasing the magazine. maybe some parishioners, you know, who sees you there. Didn't I see you at church on Sunday? You know, you're there in the queue with you know, a magazine, a pornographic magazine, and then you also have to pay. You have to pay for it, right? So all these factors created obstacles, right? The person would think twice before going to the, you know, would think twice before going to the wherever they sold them. They would think twice before going because they would think, well, you know, I'm so and so, I have to pay this, and then so these were sort of these inhibitors, mainly social inhibitors. Social inhibitors, so people were not looking at pornography. Now there aren't any inhibitors. The only inhibitor can be your conscience. Or if you've reached the point of, the child has reached the point of some kind of addiction, then the fact that they are now, they finally acknowledge that they're addicted. And this is becoming more and more widespread with children. I mean, starting, you know, if they're starting at 13 years old, and this goes on for several years, then they're addicts even before they finished high school. There's something unwanted. What is unwanted? Well, there are consequences, right? You can imagine you are engaged in these acts and you say it's unwanted because you know there are consequences. What are the consequences? Well, a person's personal life, right? They have to go to work, or they have to study, or they need to go to sleep, and they're kept awake because of these the time spent consuming pornography. Then there's also the risk of looking at more extreme pornography to maintain the neurochemical rush, since earlier pornographic consumption does not sustain the excitement that was once experienced. This is called desensitization. So the more that you're looking at pornography, the more you get bored because you've been looking at these images. These images were not as exciting as they once were. The child can find the image boring after a while because they're used to a lot of stimuli as it is. So they're looking at more and more what's called extreme forms of pornography. Extreme forms of pornography. So this is the result of desensitization. And then, of course, it also affects our, you know, our perception, the perception we have of others. And the child then, at a very, very early age, will start to sexualize others, sees their body as something sexual, and others as something sexual. Right, so for adolescents, as I said, it leads to the sexualization of the human body, distortion of human sexuality. Early addiction can start at 12 years old. This goes on for 2 years as a habit. At 14 years old, the adolescent is already a sexual addict. There's an effect on brain development because the adolescent brain has its own development. Minors risk being led to online and in-person sexual images. All right, and then there's the problem of sexting that arises, and minors can even be confused about their sexuality. They can become more vulnerable, right? This is what happens when you're looking at different pornographic images, and then the child starts to go from, you know, heterosexual images to homosexual images, and then it starts to affect their sexual development as well. So there's this sense of powerlessness, which with any addiction, I just cannot do anything about it. I cannot stop. I just, you know, I've tried, no success, relapse after relapse. This is like typical for all addictions, not just pornography. You see certain parallels in addictions. The person is acting out after a couple of days, weeks, months. The child will not say, I need a fix or I need to be medicated. That's still the language of someone who's somewhat older. But in her work, her name is Sue Silverman, who was suffered from sexual addiction. This is the language that she uses, right? The language is the same language as the language of drugs, which tells you that sexuality, her sexuality is used as a kind of drug to feel better. So what makes pornography so addictive? It creates neurobiological tension, right? So this is experienced in the body, this tension within the body, and then this tension that builds up needs to be released, right? The body builds more and more tension, and it's released in sexual acts. Then with the sexual act, there's an experience of a neurochemical rush, this rush experience. And this is because dopamine is being released in the brain, and this is where we talk about pleasure. In actual fact, everything is going on in the brain. I mean, it's the body that, the senses of the body that experience it, but it's in the brain where the pleasure actually is experienced. So the intensity, then what happens? You have this intense experience of pleasure. What does pleasure want? Pleasure wants to be repeated. Wants to be repeated. Pleasure needs to be repeated. What are the psychological factors that would lead then to pornography that, from a habit, it occurs once and becomes a habit until finally it's an addiction? It could be dealing with stress, It could be simply an argument with a parent, and then the child, just as an escape mechanism, turns to pornography. Dealing with stress, maybe because at school, in friendships and things like that, being bored, connected to loneliness, and childhood sexual trauma, right, can also be a factor that leads to pornographic addiction or even sexual addiction. So an earlier study that was done by Patrick Carnes called Don't Call It Love, he found that in sexual addiction, most instances, the child or the addict had already suffered from some kind of sexual trauma in childhood, some form of sexual abuse. However, this is no longer the case. It's not a matter of experiencing sexual trauma in childhood that's going to dispose you to addiction. It is really the use of pornography. It is the exposure to pornography and then the use of pornography for these different reasons, right? I was talking to he must have been about 13 years old, who was already having a problem with pornography, and he told me that he looks at pornography whenever he's alone at home, if he's by himself. So already he's not going out, he's not being with his friends, he's not playing or anything like that. And I asked him why he doesn't go out and play with his friends. And he says because he's not allowed out of the house. So the parents are kind of scared of him going out and playing with his friends because they're not home. They don't want him to get injured, or they don't want him to get, I guess, maybe kidnapped or something. So they figure the safest place for him is in the house. The only thing is he's bored, he's alone, and he finds his escape through pornography. This, as I said, is a 13-year-old. All right, so when we talk about sexual trauma, it could be something as simple as shame. The child feels shame because of something that occurred, or it could be exposure to pornography, or it could be the result of sexual abuse. And as I said, it seems to be less and less the case that it's a result of sexual abuse, although that would be part of reasons why a person might be disposed to addiction. But something like shame, an example of this would be the first case of sexual addiction that I was dealing with involved someone who said he was only a kid, he was a child, he was in a locker, in the woman's locker, because he was with his mother, and his mother did not want him to be left outside, so she brings him into the woman's locker. And of course, being in a woman's locker, he was staring at the woman in the locker. And his mother caught him staring at the woman, and so she admonishes him for that, right? And he told me that since that time as a child, the way she had reproached him because he was looking at the women in the locker, in the showers, because these were showers, it wasn't just a locker room, it was a shower room. That since that time, it gave him this, it affected him in his perception of female sexuality, and as a result, it led him to early use of pornography. This would be an example of shame, right? And this is not uncommon, where a child that has experienced shame is disposed to pornography as a result. Sexting, this can be simply the result of someone gets this unexpected picture of a naked person. It could be a friend of hers in the class or a friend of his from school in the classroom, and then there's this expectation that they're going to be sending this nude picture of themselves in return, and so starts this exchange of nude pictures through not through the internet as such, but simply through the pictures that they take of themselves and then send it to to their friends. From sexting to cybersex, which is there's a whole cyber world of criminal sexual activity. This is where we find predators, and the predators are looking typically for minors. This is why if minors are not, their use of the internet is not properly monitored, they can find themselves communicating with a predator, but they use obviously false ID, right? I mean, you think maybe you're communicating with another 12 or 14-year-old, and in actual fact, it's a predator looking. Their objective is to get pictures from minors and then to use them on the internet. Studies show that sexual addiction now starts as early as 14 years old. Now notice this is a 2010 study, and it is changing very, very quickly, right? Because of the development in technology, the access to technology, and what was less common is now becoming more and more common. So why are pornography consumers increasing among adolescents? Children come across pornography without looking for it. This is called inadvertent exposure. It's not like they're looking for it. They can just come across it. They can be disgusted, confused, may even affect them psychologically. Someone whom I was helping in spiritual direction, he said that the first time he came across pornography was at his friend's place, and he was only about 6 years old, but he was basically really disgusted with the pornography. Now, his friends who were older, they thought this was funny, a lot of fun, entertainment, but it traumatized him. He was only 6, and the images really stuck in his mind. So this is where you can have a psychological effect. Boys, girls may be introduced to pornography by their friends, home or at school. Older boys, girls without parental monitors, controls on their computer or phone. Sexting is sending out nudes of oneself and expecting nudes in return. And this is where the other person can even feel pressure. Like, I've sent you a nude picture of myself, now aren't you going to send me one in return? So there's this even pressure to return these nude pictures. And as a result, what we see more and more is a sexualized culture. And the sexualized culture reflects not just the widespread use of pornography, but even our advertising industry, our music industry. I wrote an article that was published on the sexualization of children, how children are used in the media, right? And this is what surrounds us. And in the midst of this, we are trying to foster a chaste environment. So pornography is reinforced at various levels. The social, where our culture itself, we live in a sexualized society. The movie industry, the music industry, these are all big influences on adolescents. The celebrities, the singers, movie stars, and so forth. Advertising, how is advertising? Advertising uses sex. Education syllabi, where the children are simply not prepared for what they're being taught. And the social media, where adolescents especially, they're not looking for these sexualized images, but they are there. Also, the political aspect that reinforces the sexualized environment in terms of rights and freedoms, where we know children younger and younger now have rights that even the parents have no control over. So there's a whole political context that we live in. And finally, the anthropological, we saw this when we were talking about a materialist or positivistic vision of the person, where the body is simply material and we have forgotten the soul, right? The anthropology must take into account both body and soul. So pornography is not just a personal problem, it is a social problem. We all have our part to make, our bodies, our homes, and our communities, holy dwellings. We have a responsibility to help children, adolescents growing in chaste surroundings. So it's not just his problem or her problem, it is each of us needs to contribute to create an environment that is chaste. So the support for children, the first would be their parents, but also through confession and spiritual accompaniment, through a Catholic therapeutic support or counseling, depending on the issues that are involved. and of course, computer or phone monitors. I have a list here of different parental controls. These come from a center of sexual exploitation that they're trying to prevent sexual exploitation. I was told that some of these are obsolete, others are missing. I'm not very up to date with technology because I only use technology for teaching purposes, and that's about it. But it's up to the parents. Whenever you have some technology in the home, the children have access to it, then it's up to the parents to make sure they are updated with the parental monitors. Thank you. Right, so this is what is being handed out right now. There are two books. One made this way, some of you might be familiar with it, by Lila Miller and Trent Horn. It's preparing kids through tough moral issues, and they cover like all the different moral issues. Trent Horn is a Catholic apologist. He is a very good, very reliable source. This book here, the one on the right, Uncompromising Purity, has to do with sexual addiction, specifically with females. It's increasing more and more among females. This book was recommended to me because she knew that I was doing some talks on sexual addiction, pornography, by a sister in Vancouver, a Dominican sister who teaches at a high school. And she was just pointing out to me that this is the book that she recommends to her female students who are dealing with the pornography. Okay, this is the book that I already mentioned. The one on the left is the book that I've written. It covers sexual addiction at large, and I use a Thomistic anthropology as a way of trying to resolve the problem of addiction. So it's within a framework of St. Thomas Aquinas. And this other one called Wired for Intimacy by William Struthers. It looks specifically at the male brain and how pornography hijacks the male brain. That's the title of the book. This is also a pretty good book. He looks at pornography from the more neurochemical aspect or effects that it has. Okay, so we'll end with this. Blessed are the pure in heart, they shall. Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is, if you take abortion also as an example, and masturbation, pornography as well, that these, what are serious sins, are being normalized because of the high frequency, right? Like everybody does this, it's high frequency, and therefore it comes across as something that is normal. But frequency does not determine normalcy, right? The act itself remains intrinsically disordered or sinful. So it depends on what the relationship is, what relationship you have with this person. A young adolescent who's still trying to figure out how to stop, for example, or whether it's even there's anything wrong with it. I came across an adolescent who did not know that there was anything wrong with pornography. He literally did not know, right? He did not know. Nobody told him that there was something wrong. We never heard that there was something wrong. Again, the problem when something is widespread, it seems normal. And then even in schools, I've had professors say that masturbation is something natural, right? So when you're exposed to this kind of thing, then you need to, again, this is why the age makes a difference. If you're an adult, then you would just do your own homework and say, okay, well, let me see. Our first point of reference is always the Catholic Catechism. What does the Catholic Catechism teach? Then based on the Catholic Catechism, you say, okay, well, this is something wrong, I need to correct it. Okay, so the age of the person, the relationship of the person, are they struggling with this, or they do not see it as an issue? These are all different factors that need to be taken into account. Now, your original question was that concerning shame. How do yes, if a parent finds out that their child is masturbating, and you tell your child you're not supposed to be masturbating, the child's going to feel shame. There's no doubt about that, because he or she has somehow failed to live up to the parents' expectations, and that's what shame is. They found out now that I'm not this good, holy son. I'm in fact this sinful little boy. Yes, and that would create shame. So the way the parent approaches it, the case that I gave you, it was an awkward situation for the boy to be in. I mean, he was in this women's locker with with his mother and all these other women who were taking showers. Of course, he was going to be distracted by these women, but his mother admonished him for that, right? Admonished him, and she could have just said, you know, we have to go, rather than admonish him. He did not choose to go into these lockers. His mother brought him there. So you would have to look at how these individual situations, right? Like what, you know, who, is it a mother? Is it a friend? Is it, you know, what age is the person at? These are all different factors that need to be taken into account. I mean, human sexuality is also something very personal and very private. Like we don't, that's why it's often difficult for parents to talk about their children, about, you know, there are these different sexual stages that they go through. The point, I think the point of reference now is going to be the internet for information. Like this seems to be the go-to place for adults as much as children. You just can hope that they find the right resources for the information that they're looking for. But that, because especially with human sexuality, it's very, it's not easy something to talk about. In our home, sex was basically a taboo topic. Nobody, and we still do not talk about any sexual topics in our home. And still, when I talk to my nephews and nieces, we do not talk about sexual topics at all. It is considered something very personal, very private, and we don't discuss it. So where did I learn everything? Basically through books, right? Reading books, and eventually studying the catechism and so forth. But you know, different families are very different in how they approach the matter of sexuality as well.
But the point, though, is somehow or another, the message has got to be given to the boy that is not right. Eh? I mean, somehow or another, that has to be done without shaming. And this is where the experience, the relationship, the mother and father, whoever, has to do it in a way that is not too harsh or shameful, you know?
I think any Catholic kid will learn sooner or later what is sexually permissible and what is not. Sooner or later, they will find out either through their own reading or through the church catechesis and so forth. It's hard to imagine any Catholic going to school, going to confession, receiving the sacraments, that they're going to simply spend their life not thinking that there's anything wrong with it. They might want to think there's nothing wrong with it, but that's different from not knowing there is anything wrong. And sooner or later, it will come up in confession, would be addressed with the priest, and the priest would be able to explain that these acts are, they go against nature. But I think it's important for the boy or the girl to, in a way, learn through a kind of self-discovery process as well. Not that they need to be told. That is the risk with shame, and shame can have a powerful psychological effect. And one of the factors that dispose the person to addiction, because they've already felt shame. There's a whole book written on shame and sexuality, that then disposes the person at an early age to these sexual habits that are even worse, right, such as addiction. Yeah.
One thing I kind of heard in Marlon's question was, when the environment that the child is in doesn't support at all Catholic teaching, that conflict of how do you, it's the political area that
Right.
you put out. So how do parents move in an environment like that when it's what is being taught is not true?
Yeah, so you're talking about in the school system where what the school is teaching is not true, is that right?
Mm-hmm. And the society.
Yeah, okay, so the school, the society, again, normalizing everything that we know, whether it's same-sex relations, whether it's abortion, whether it's pornography, whether it's masturbation, all of this seems to be normalized by our society. How does a child learn to grow up and realize that there are things wrong with this? I think what we have seen based on this council document is that if the child is brought up in a Catholic environment that values chastity and love in its proper place, that recognizes the significance of celibacy, a home where there is prayer and so forth, I think the child will understand that. They will understand. Remember, I spoke about natural law at the very start. Natural law tells us certain things are disordered, right? So even a person who's addicted to pornography, that person does not feel great after viewing pornography. The person feels typical because they know they've spent all this time just looking at trash, right? And they're treating their body as trash. They know that, and that's why it is a vicious cycle that is so hard to get out of, because then to feel better, they look at more pornography, right? So natural law tells us that there is something wrong. I don't even need the scriptures. I don't even need the society. I know there is something wrong with my actions, that somehow they violate my sexual acts would be violating the sexual purpose intended for my sexuality. The person would understand that. Within the context, the child would eventually come to understand that as an adolescent. Within the context of a family, that is a prayerful family. You cannot just say, I need to correct my children when it comes to sexuality, and then there's nothing spiritual in the home, right? That is almost, that's being more tyrannical than anything else. There has to be a spiritual, religious, prayerful culture in the home where everything is coherent, right? There is a sense of chastity in the home. There's a sense of love between the parents that is manifested towards the children. There's a coherency in terms of how the faith is lived in the home. And then the child will understand what is right and what is wrong, regardless of our society, right? But this has to be rooted in the home. This is the whole point of this document. And then there's natural law to help us. We have natural law. God created us with our intelligence that can tell us that certain things simply violate the natural order. And those are sins, what we call, theologically, the word for that is sin, right? Violate natural order. It's a sin.
Thank you, Father Dave, and I think that we have all, in one way or another, experienced the challenge we have today in our society. Later on, we'll have some drinks, and you may have some other questions that you want to share with Father Dave or with the others. You would be more than welcome. Thank you, Father Dave, for your Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The Lord be with you. And with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let us go in the peace of the Lord.
Thank you, God.